Hey everyone, you're watching Conversationality, a bi-weekly show brought to you by Optionality, your community exploring the now of work. Greetings, Jory Desjardins here, co-founder of Optionality.
And I'm Elisa Camahort Page, the other co-founder. Thanks for joining us today.
I'm not speaking for Elisa. I'm just going to let her go. What we were talking, as we always do, Elisa and I talk quite a bit about what are we going to talk about this week, and we deferred to. There's so much that we could talk about, and we didn't want to depress people. There was a lot that we've been talking about, and we are addressing that stuff. We'll have some announcements from Optionality for things that we really are planning to help us all address the uncertainty, which I think is sort of a euphemism right now for what we are all experiencing.
Yeah.
But today, given all of the uncertainty, we wanted to address the theme for this month of programming in February around transitions. It's kind of an ongoing theme, honestly, with Optionality. I think that's probably the thread that so many of us share in this community. But when it comes to transitions, part of the challenge of those transitions is figuring out how to have them, how to do them right. And it's a really big part of our mission to really dig into the tactics behind transitions and how are others doing them, figuring out through best practices. Why do we have to reinvent the wheel every time we have a transition? Why can't we learn from each other? So we thought that this week we would approach transitions and talk about some of our own, not because we're perfect and we did them perfectly right, but because we learned something from those transitions.
Right. Another word for it that I've been using, which is a word I used to hate, actually. I used to really hate the word pivot. And I think pivot is often used for startups when they realize their initial take at a business model wasn't going to work. It's sometimes used for bigger companies. But I think I've had less transitions, which to me implies sort of a gentle, natural evolution. The things I'm going to talk about today, that couple of instances in my life, are really more pivots where I just went bang, 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 bounced from industry to industry, like totally. And I think that's worth thinking about because, what could I bring from what I knew to a totally new environment? How could I package, what I was good at in a completely different industry? And I think that we know a lot of people who are just getting into very different things. And so just so you know, we're rolling out today our webinar in 2 weeks that's going to feature a couple of folks from our community who have really interesting transitions and like transitions and pivots. Some of it seems super organic and some of it is like, whoa, left field. And then we're doing our second Optionality in Real Life event and the first in 2025 at the end of this month on the 26th in Oakland. And we're covering that theme again, because I think if you can get people to talk about the sort of 360 degree, like how did they decide, what was the trigger? How did they, once they had that trigger, how did they finally decide to make the leap? How did you adjust your mindset? There's a whole emotional aspect to leaving something behind and going forward. And then what about the practical stuff? Like, what about money? We were just, before we came on, we were talking about health insurance, like stuff like that, because if whether it's a gentle organic transition or a hard, right angle turn to a pivot, there's uncertainty in that change. And it's not just uncertainty about one aspect of your life. I think it really affects every aspect of your life. So we're just hoping to tell a lot of stories this month that show how people got to those, including us. Today, we're going to talk about ours. So, Jory, I know you want to talk about a transition that was pretty recent for you.
I mean, recent if you look at the span of my career, but it was years ago. I mean, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago at this point, maybe 7.
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm at an age where
Recent.
5 or 6
Yeah,
years ago seems
careful
recent.
with that. For some people, they've only been working for 7 years
Okay,
or less.
yeah,
But
fine.
yes, it was a relatively, recent one, and I've had so many. I'm like a career pinball. I've had so many pivots. I mean,
Mhm.
if anything, I think that is the commonality in all of my gigs. It's like, "Oh, pivot, 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 pivot."
Mm,
For me, the challenge is finding the thread and having these pivots mean something. But for me, this pivot occurred about 7 years ago. We'd exited our startup.
mm,
I was consulting and advising, and one of the companies that I had advised had asked me, when he asked me to be an advisor for him, he had chosen me and reached out to me because I had been a media executive, and he was building a virtual reality. Actually, cross that out. It was an augmented or a mixed reality, actually, media marketplace. So imagine you're in a virtual scenario and you're seeing ads show up like a billboard or opportunities and offers. If you're in a Starbucks, wearing your MR headset. So this was a definitely a maximalist view on the world, that AR and at the time MR, which is mixed reality, a combination of VR and AR, were going to take over the world. It hasn't quite worked out that way. So there's a whole other commentary on mixed reality, but he reached out to me to really assess his plan. It was almost like an ad server in mixed reality. And at the time, I was like, look, there's just not enough people, not enough eyeballs in here. It's cool, but it's just too soon. And we started to kind of play with the model. And he said something that I heard for the first time in that conversation, but was to actually become my next career turn, which was, well, maybe we can tokenize the data and incent developers to build more in this space by giving us their data, and we'll tokenize that effort. And I was like, what? Why? What are you talking about? Like, why would people do that? And he said, well, you built a network, an ad network, and how did you compensate people? And I, explained it. And he said, okay, so now we're going to do it with tokens, and it's all going to back into crypto. And he had, up until that point, unbeknownst to me, fundraised and funded his company up to that point on crypto. So he was
wow.
very familiar with the economics and the fundamentals of that. And at this point, I was intrigued. I'm like, wow. So we can take all that is broken in the current ad system. And I had a lot of issues with the ad, the way it had become programmaticized, all of the data issues, all of the privacy issues. I thought this could be a way of eliminating all that and literally creating a whole new platform and template for advertising. We ended up hiring a firm by the name of Consensus to help us think through our business plan, help us with marketing. And I had no idea what Consensus really was. I just thought they were a marketing firm. No, they were the first venture studio backed by the co-founder of Ethereum, a very big cryptocurrency named Joe Lubin. Um, who that were they were invested in helping other startups in the space build, and it was unclear what they got out of it. I was not clear, but I was intrigued, and I thought, wow, it's like this whole alternative universe that I want to be a part of, kind of like, the social media world way back 20 years ago when we were starting to kind of forge the rules and the regulations. I wanted to do that in the blockchain world.
Mm,
So I ended up pivoting and becoming a manager or leader in this world at Consensus. Not quite knowing what I was getting into. It was more of just this, I'm deeply curious. I have management experience, and you need people to help form rules, regulations, KPIs in this space, and I can learn while I do it.
mm,
What I did not anticipate, and what really made this such a powerful pivot, is that it was run as a holacracy, which some of us may know what that means. I sure as hell did not, which means that it is tierless, I guess. It's meant to be, there are no managers, even if you bring skill sets that are around being a manager, there isn't a reporting structure. So I was, in essence, being a team lead and leading a group that did not acknowledge that there was a hierarchical structure. So it was inherently a little bonkers. And there was a lot of, well, a lot of ego that had to go away, but also a lot of just constant sorting and clarifying, and not just for me, for everybody, right? And it was so unique. I mean, I look back on it actually a lot more fondly than I may be making it sound,
Huh.
because everybody was in this place of let's figure this out.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of, I mean, we had folks that kind of came in with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, and they were, we called them the crypto anarchists, who were like, hey, screw the patriarchy, screw managers. I don't want to be managed. I'm not here to make money. And I'm like, well, but you're paid here. So, we got to kind of chip in and figure and do our part. So there was a lot of, I brought a very clear set of background and skills to this role, but I had to navigate in a totally different space. And I remember having some pretty deep conversations with you at the time, like, am I going crazy? Because this is not what I thought I signed up for.
Mm,
But at the end, I think it really did. I impact me in ways that I'm only now just understanding,
hmm.
in terms of being able to navigate change in seeming chaos and get stuff done and create structure and create camaraderie and bringing people in and enrolling them into a vision.
So I have a couple questions. When you went to go advise the company through which you met the consensus folks, how did you get to that company? Was that someone you had worked with before? The person who had you advising them?
Yeah,
Um, so
network.
that through your
Network.
network. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I had started to get to know other entrepreneurs in blockchain and met other entrepreneurs in blockchain. And then one of them introduced me to someone who was there. There's a name that Consensus used to describe itself, and it was called the mesh.
Hmm.
And literally, it was like you meet one piece of the mesh, and then you suddenly start to meet the rest of the mesh. And it really did work that way. I met one person who introduced me to a next. Next thing I know, they're like, oh, we actually need someone to help us expand our global marketing function. They had a leader and she wanted to kind of operationalize it more. And I'm like, oh, yeah, sure. I'll do that if I can learn. That was kind of the deal that we struck.
Hmm.
But it was a pretty, I mean, I'm used to networking in. That's usually kind of how we get stuff done. That part was no problem. It was once I was in and trying to understand how it operated, that was really the challenge.
So I know that was that before or after your stint at the very large e-commerce site?
um, it was right before, right before. In fact,
So
that company was a partner. That's how I got to know them.
I see. What I'm
Yeah,
curious about is that once you worked in that holacracy, even if it wasn't the architecture you might choose to replicate exactly again, did it change your either ability or desire to work in very rigid hierarchy
yeah.
again?
I will say this, you can always have too much of something, right? And I think uh, you and I, when we started our first company, we were all about changing the models of work, but the models of media. I
Right.
love disruption, but you can have too much disruption. And I think that I went whole hog into a big tech after this because it was so unstructured that I realized I craved a little structure. I needed to have some rules of engagement in place. Um, there just wasn't enough there. And I actually hit my limit, which I didn't think was possible.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Um, but did it make it hard to adjust in the new environment that was very, very different?
No, no. If anything, I had learned to take and this was a real lesson, I think, if I had to describe what I really got from working in a holacracy, is I had to create some structure and I had to get people on board.
Mm.
And when I got to the big tech company, it had been in chaos, leaderless, didn't have a
Um,
structure, and it helped me to kind of understand, oh, I first thing I need to do is coalition build, is
huh,
figure out the people that are influencing what we're doing, figure this out. It was a ongoing challenge, there's no question about it, but I think it helped me get very clear on what needed to happen first. And I don't think I would have been much more flat-footed, I think,
interesting.
right? I think we
Yeah,
go
yeah,
in with expectations of how these things are supposed to work, and then when all that is gone, what next?
yeah. Interesting. It's funny because you already had so many experiences and tools in your toolkit. And, the pivot story I was going to tell, or the transition story I was going to tell, was from very early in my career, because I think it cemented some ways of thinking about how I could work or what I could do. 'Cause, I think I've talked before. I was a theater major. I moved to New York after college and pursued that. And after living in New York for 4 years, I realized, first of all, this is a total crapshoot. The late 80s weren't a great time on Broadway. It was not many shows were opening. There wasn't a lot going on. And so I kind of realized that I could work hard and be great for a long time and never get anywhere. Like tons of people I personally knew who I thought were super talented and, had never been on Broadway. And I also really missed California. Like, I thought I would adapt well to New York because my mother grew up there. My grandmother lived there. I'd been there countless times. But I think it's just really different living somewhere than visiting. And and especially when you don't have money. I mean, it's not a, on the one hand, there are many ways you can live in New York and not have a ton of money, but it's not
Yes.
the fun, glamorous experience it could maybe be without money. So I really wanted to come back to California. And the first way I came back was through a job offer through a guy who was a friend of the family. And he was a commodities trader, an individual registered commodity trading advisor. And he just worked out of his one person office and he had a trading assistant. Now, I mean, for some context, I wasn't just like a theater major and super liberal artsy. I actually actively thought I wasn't good at math, or I wasn't good at, I just was kind of phobic. My father, my sister, and my brother were all super genius at math and science. So I was like, the middle child has to be totally different. And so it was kind of, you know, interesting. I come into commodities and I literally knew nothing about it. I just didn't understand what a commodity was. I'll never forget the example he gave me. At the time, there was this car, the Acura NSX, which was super fancy, like the Dodge Viper, kind of super fancy sports car. And he said, people are buying the car from the dealer, and it's not going to come for 6 months. Hey, Tesla would be a good example, of that. Happened with the early Teslas, back before its sales started tanking because of whatever's happening now. I just have to throw that in. People would buy the contract. They weren't going to get the car for months, and they would sell the contract to somebody else who super wanted that car for more money. So they were selling a future contract for a car and making a profit on it. And so that was kind of his foundational explanation. Anyway, I ended up tracking his trades and his positions and executing them. I would call the brokers, in Chicago and New York. It was all done on the phone. And I would ask, buy 50 bushels of corn or whatever it was. I used to, for years, I could tell you all the symbols, because you bought, there were futures. I probably still could do it. February is G, because you bought a specific month. I want to sell X amount of February soybeans. or buy May corn, and every month had a code, and each commodity had a code, like a stock symbol, right? So I would place the trades, and I would get the reports back, and I would keep his positions. And then at the end of every month, I would do his accounting, his bookkeeping on this system of a local vendor who made systems specifically for commodity traders. So one interesting thing I learned is that this guy, he made a ton of money as a trader on the floor in Chicago. When he started trading other people's money, he didn't have the same, he got much more nervous about it. He got much more conservative. He got really constrained because it was other people's money. He was happy to risk his own, because commodities is kind of known as a higher risk category. So he started like not having great returns. That when someone invests in commodities, it's the higher risk, higher reward. Well, he wasn't delivering them. He wasn't risking their money much, but he wasn't delivering them high reward. And they're like, I could do other things with this money. So he started to like lose customers. I could see the writing on the wall. So I had gotten my sister a job at the accounting system firm. Now she was a math and econ major. So that like made all the sense in the world. I ended up doing accounting for commodity traders and commodity pool operators at this firm. I would do their monthly accounting, and it was always kind of hilarious to me because I thought I was not good at math. But I discovered actually there is something to love about math, which is that if you are 1 penny off, if you just keep working, you will find the penny. It's like a tangible thing. It's also like not something you keep thinking and thinking, how could I do that better? No. I mean, you just book the transactions and like it balances or it doesn't, and you investigate. So like marketing, which I later, got into, you could always, how can I message? I don't know how many times I've adjusted messaging, but if we tweak this word, is it transitions or is it pivots or is it, that is not what it's like when you're doing this kind of bookkeeping. So there's something very beautiful about knowing if there's an error, you can find it, and something beautiful about knowing that this is how it works. It just works like this, and you don't have to keep rethinking. And it can, some things you do in life, you're like, it could always be better. You could always be improving it, and that is really not true with balancing your monthly, finances. So, but the main thing I learned is that I can learn, and you said that earlier today about, well, you figured you just learn. So yeah. I learned that at the age of like 26, this thing I thought I couldn't do at all, I actually was perfectly fine at doing, I could learn. So when the guy who ran this company wanted to move the office like 50 miles away, I was like, I am not commuting like that. And I started looking around and I'm like, oh, this tech thing seems kind of big. Maybe I should try and get into tech. And once again, through my network, I went and interviewed at a few places because I had friends working there in some position or another. I focused on marketing because in a very small company like the commodities firm was, I was sort of responsible for the trade show booth and the brochure and the outreach letter. I did these little tiny marketing things. So I'm like, oh, and so I learned a couple things. So then I ended up going and working in the marketing department of a hardware company, really traditional high-tech telecom networking equipment. And so 2 things I learned there, which was that it was okay. I took a step back in pay a little bit, and I became an admin for the VP of marketing. And, I was already like a manager. I had like a title at this little tiny firm. And I think even this guy said, why do you want to be like my admin? And I literally said to him, I can remember to the word, I said, well, in about a year, we're going to have to talk about like where else I can do and what else I can do. But for the next year, you're going to have the best admin you've ever had. And I was great. I was just really focused on doing a great job at the job I had so that he would help me get the job I next wanted. And, but in the meantime, I took a little step back in title, even in money a little bit. And I'm like, yeah, but the upside potential is so much greater. Where am I ever going to go in this little 7-person company? And where are the other jobs? It wasn't like today where people can have companies all over. If you wanted to rise in the industry of commodities and finance, you probably should live in New York or Chicago, right? So I'm like, I need to get into tech because that's where all the upside potential is. And it happened to be the late 90s. So it was the dot-com boom era. So, but once again, I learned I could learn because I learned how the technology worked. And I had one product manager I worked for who taught me how to do schematics for his product line, who taught me how to make data sheets. He like taught me product management stuff because he wanted help. And like you said, building coalitions and getting people to like dive in where they could dive in. I wanted to dive in because I wanted to expand what I knew and learn, things, because that would help me get to the next place where I was a product manager for a product. But that lesson of learning I could learn, that I didn't have to walk in knowing everything, that there are people in every company. If you're in a company and you need to learn something about how it runs, find, like Mr. Rogers says, find the helpers, find the people who love what they do so much, they would love to whiteboard for you how this works. They'll never stop being intrigued by that. The fact that you're expressing interest is like exciting to them. And there are a lot of people at these companies, they sit and they are working on their stuff all day. And like, there are people there who are excited to teach you if you want to learn, but you have to ask the questions. And so I really learned about that. And I think I've just taken that through wherever I go, whatever I do. Like, I'm like, well, I'll figure it out. I can learn. There were people who will know. And I go in assuming, why wouldn't they want to teach me? Did I ever encounter people who were withholding and like wanted to keep all their cards close to their vest? Yeah, but I don't think they're the majority. I think the majority want to be part of a team, is excited to talk about what they do and share knowledge. And I don't know, was that your experience? You've been in a lot of different industries at this point.
Without question. I mean, I use the blockchain one because it was so stark, but I want to
Mm.
add one more little mini lesson that was in
Yeah,
there, because I've been asked many times about how I pivoted and how I made that work. You have to be flexible. Yes, I was not paid the way I was,
yeah,
but I was still able to negotiate because of what I did bring to the table. And in this case, there were certain things that I had done. I mean, I built a digital community, and they really had this vision of building out a community of developers, of companies, of organizations that were all using this blockchain. So there was a lot of lessons that I could teach them. I programmed events. We had a whole week at South by Southwest where we had a program. So I was able to say, here's what I can do, right? I'm going to learn from you, but here's what you'll get for that. And being able to really articulate that was important. And I think you can do that for almost any transition. I'm sure there are some that are real tricky, but figuring out what you can bring
yeah,
to the table, like Elisa saying, like, I will be the best admin you ever. I mean, Elisa, I know that's not like what you love to do, but you are one of the most organized people and can, get a lot done effectively. And it's a superpower you can bring to the table. Like, I can turn this around if you give me that chance. And I got
yeah.
to sit and learn and watch people who are world renowned and knew this space speak. And I got to help them. I went to events where there were thought leaders, all of the stuff I wanted exposure to, I got to do by offering up what I already knew.
Yeah, and what I think is so great about your story before we wrap up, is that it shows that what I experienced as a 20 something, late 20 something, that mind of the beginner, or mind of the adaptability and flexibility, and like just seeing what you can work out, you were applying that when you were quite senior in your career. It shows that it's never over, that opportunity to say, I can learn, I can adapt, I can switch, I can trade off, I can our I think, careers, you used to think they go up and to the right. Like, if you're not doing that up and to the right, in one area, you're wasting your potential. But I actually think it shows that across your life, it
Yeah.
enhances your potential to keep learning, keep trying new things, keep doing things. So I actually, in the end, I think it's great that I picked something early career and you picked something relatively recent. So, folks,
Relatively.
thanks for joining us today. Every 2 weeks, we host a Conversationality, sometimes with guests. Sometimes it's just us and we just talk about what's going on. In the meantime, come and visit us over at Optionality. It's optionality.life is our URL. And you can check out both our public membership, which has a bunch of, we're releasing a lot of content around this new world of work all the time. Or there's premium membership where there's a lot more stuff that happens in our community, in real life and online convening and coming together. And we would love to have you join us and support your exploration of how you can build a more optionality driven life. We'll see you
Till
next time.